We have the telescope, we have the mount, and then we suddenly realize we want to do astrophotography, which means we most likely need a camera. And that's what we're going to check out today. So we need a camera, obviously, for astrophotography. And if you thought this would be an easy topic, no, it isn't. There is, as always, a huge selection and a lot of considerations to be made. But let's start with something like this. You might have something like this at home. What's wrong with this? Can we make astrophotography with such a camera? The answer is absolutely. I started simply with such a camera and nothing else. And the result that I got was this here. If you're interested to do something like this just for fun, I can recommend you the videos of Nico Carver where he explains how to do that. I will leave a link in the description below. This was how I started. It gives you a first taste of what's possible. But quite obviously, such a lens is not a telescope. So can we connect such a camera to a telescope would be your next question. And the answer is absolutely. So we take the lens off, we buy such an adapter, we click it on here, we take some spacers, we screw the spacers on here, and we can connect that to the telescope. And obviously we could also put a filter in here and so on. That is possible. And some people do astrophotography this way. So the advantage of that is that if I have already such a camera, I don't have to buy something new. And also I can use this camera for other photography with traditional lenses. What are the disadvantages? Like everything else what I have not mentioned before. And we will come to that when we will look at the real Astro-cameras. But there is one huge disadvantage when you use such a camera. And that is that they are made, obviously, for daylight, for traditional photography. And in traditional photography, what we do not like is infrared light. That brings a lot of disadvantages. Because of that, all of these cameras have an infrared filter right built into that. This is not such a big a problem when you shoot galaxies or star clusters, but as soon as you want to shoot nebula, they are, for the largest part, in the near infrared spectrum, which is mostly cut off by these cameras. Now you can actually send such a camera to certain services who will remove this filter, or you could also buy a dedicated camera which has this filter already removed. But then the question is, why don't you buy an Astro camera in the first place? So the clear message here is, if you have such a camera, as a start, it's absolutely possible. Here again, a picture I have made with a telescope and such a camera. But you just have to be aware, it's just for the start. At one point, you will have to invest into a real Astro camera. Now, when we look at real Astro cameras, we have to divide them in certain groups. And the first factor, how we differentiate them, is cooled versus uncooled. So here you actually see an uncooled camera. This is a dedicated Astro camera from Sevo, an ASI 585 MC. So you will mostly hear of Sevo. When we talk about cameras, this is the brand that dominates here the market. I don't know how much of the market they have. I would guess around 80% probably. And so with Sevo, all the cameras start with the ASI. Then comes a number, here the 585, that indicates what sensor is in here. Then comes either MC or MM. MC means color camera, MM means monochrome. We will discuss about that. And then in the back, there's either nothing or a Pro. and Pro means cooled, nothing means uncooled. So you see that these uncooled cameras, they're rather small. In comparison, this black thing here is my cooled camera, which is now for a change not a SIBO camera, that's a Moravian camera, and we will discuss that in the brand section. But you see, from a size point of view, that's a completely different kind of camera. But actually, the real camera, the sensor, is right here at the front, and all the rest here is the cooling element. So that might lead you to the question, why should we cool a camera? And for that, remember in the first part, I told you something about signal to noise ratio. In astrophotography, we take hours and hours and hours of exposure to get a lot of signal, and what we want to do with the signal is to offset the noise. And the noise can be generated by our atmosphere, by the light pollution, but also by our camera, by our sensor. And turns out, the warmer a sensor is, the more noise it creates. So a sensor at ambient temperature already creates a lot more noise than a sensor which we cool down to minus 20 degrees Celsius. But if we do not cool a camera, the sensor does not stay at ambient temperature. But when we shoot and shoot and shoot, this sensor is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and with that creating more and more noise. And going back to our DSLR, which we had at the beginning, this is one of the big disadvantages a DSLR has against a cooled, dedicated Astro camera. And to be clear, also sensor-wise, a sensor which is in a usual DSLR is not specialized of minimizing noise. They have other properties where they're good at. So in principle, we have the wrong type of sensor, and then in addition, we heat it up. So it gives heaps of noise. So you might be asking, if cooling is so important, why actually do these uncooled Astro cameras even exist? And there are two purposes where these uncooled Astro cameras work very well. And this is on one side as guide cameras. A guide camera we use with either a separate telescope or an off-axis guider. We will discuss that in the guiding part, to follow a specific star or stars to ensure that the telescope, the mount, is always exactly on track, always exactly in the same position relative to the object we're making a photo of. And for that purpose, it really doesn't matter if there's some noise or not. So these cameras are absolutely sufficient for that. And the other purpose is that these cameras, they have a very tiny sensor, but this sensor is blazing fast, which means it can make with a video about 120 or even more exposures per second. And we use that for planetary photography. So what you see here is actually a whole optical path for planetary shooting. It looks very different than deep sky. It has also some filters, but they're also smaller. It has lenses to even magnify the picture more after it comes through the telescope, because a planet is absolutely tiny. So we do not need a large sensor, but we need to blow up this planet so that we even actually see something. And for planetary shooting, it's not so much about the noise, it's getting the right exposures at these moments when the sky is still, when everything's perfect. We call this lucky imaging. And as I mentioned in the very first part, this is a completely different method that we use for deep sky. But that's the situations where these cameras shine. And I think from what I explained you right now, there is not really a big selection here. If you want to do serious astrophotography of deep sky objects, you will need rather soon a cooled, dedicated Astro camera. And we will have a look at very different models in our brand and model section, and you will see there's some which are quite reasonably priced. And with that we come to our next big decision. and that is color, and we call it one-shot color, or you might also read OSC, one-shot color. So these are the color cameras, and then we have the monocameras, which are black and white. And again, I would assume that if you hear that for the first time, you will wonder why in the world would I take a black and white camera if I can have a color camera. Black and white is something from the past, right? Well, not really. Actually, black and white, or mono how we call it, is the better choice from a quality point of view. So why is that? For that you have to understand how color pictures are created, also in any of your cameras that you have at the moment in your home. At the bottom you have a sensor, and the sensor has pixels. And all these pixels can actually do is count the photons that hit them. And the more photons hit them, the brighter it is. So how do we create colors? We put on these pixels a Bayer matrix, how we call that. And what that is are tiny, tiny little filters. One filter only lets the red light through. The other filter only lets the blue light through. And two little filters, and for 2 pixels, the green light is let through. Why 2? Because on our nice, beautiful world, most of what we photograph is green. The trees, the grass, the shrubs, and so on. So our eyes are actually trained to differentiate green better than other colors. And so to get that the most accurate, we have 2 green pixels, 1 blue and 1 red. So RGGB, that's the usual Bayer matrix as we have it in consumer color cameras. And so what's the issue with that? Well, what you consider as 1 pixel in a color camera are in principle 4 pixels. Out of these 4 pixels, we can calculate the right color and create 1 color pixel, which means the overall resolution of the chip is actually divided by 4. And so let's move to the mono camera. Mono means there's no Bayer matrix. It's simply a sensor where each of the pixels is collecting all the photons that they are. But so how do we get here to a color picture? Well, what we do, we have filters. And you see that nicely here. This huge thing is a filter wheel. It has actually 8 filters in here, which can automatically rotate. So the computer always tells the filter wheel when to move, which filter to move, and it puts it in front of the camera. Which means, in the easy case, we first make all the photos with the red filter, then we make all the photos with the green filter, then we make all the photos with the blue filter, and then on the computer we mix the whole thing together. Sounds complicated, isn't really? And the big advantage is that we can use the full resolution of the sensor. So we have practically a 4 times higher resolution with mono shooting than with the one-shot color shooting. So if you ask now, so why shouldn't I take a mono camera? Seems to be a no-brainer. And my answer would be yes and no. Yes, because you really get the better quality out of it. No, because it's still more complicated from an equipment point of view, from a processing point of view, but it is also much more expensive. The mono cameras, they're more expensive than the color cameras. Why? Because on a consumer level, mono cameras do not exist. So these sensors, which are mono, they have to be produced dedicated for astrophotography, and that makes them more expensive. But in addition to that, you need filters. And while when you buy a filter for your camera, they cost perhaps $30, $40 or something like that, filters for astrophotography can easily cost $300, $400, $500 per filter. So a complete filter set for mono shooting can easily cost over $1,000. And so that's something that you have to put into consideration. So these are the 2 main categories: uncooled versus cooled, mono versus one-shot color. So what else is there? If you go on the CMOS side, and we will do that afterwards, you see that there's a million of different cameras. Which one to choose? So mainly what differentiates all these cameras are the different sensors. And that's actually a funny story. If you believe, if you look at the brands, you will choose the brand with the best sensor, I have to disappoint you. All the brands work with exactly the same set of CMOS sensors. So if you take now a CEVO camera, a QHY, or a Moravian, or an Attic, or whatever is out there, they all have exactly the same sensors. So what makes them so different? Well, quality and some additional features. And that's all. And we will have a look at that then on the website. But at the moment, let's focus on these sensors, because that's really what mainly guides your choice. So when we look at sensors, first of all, and that's probably what you can most relate to, is the resolution, the megapixels. That's how consumer cameras are marketed. Do we have 20 megapixels? Do we have 30? And so on. The second thing is the pixel size. The pixels, they can be smaller or larger. Smaller pixel means you get a higher resolution. Larger pixel means they can actually absorb more light and they're less prone to noise. Third criteria, chip size. And that you also know from the consumer cameras that we have with DSLRs, the APS-C chip. We have full frame cameras like now the Sony Alpha, and we have smaller chip sizes on compact cameras. And then last but not least, the more modern a chip is, the more actually light it can absorb, which means there's a smaller chance that stars burn out, so that you get to a 100% capacity of the sensor and it's just pure white. And also the more modern the sensors are, the less they are prone to noise, and so on and so on. But so your instinct might tell you, okay, so I want to have a full frame sensor, I want to have as small pixels as possible and the highest resolution possible. And while this sounds great, there are three things which might be in the way of that equation. First of all, to have a full frame sensor, your telescope must support a full frame sensor, and only rather expensive telescopes support that. The bigger your sensor, the more chances are that the further you get away from the center, the more you have distortion, vignetting, and other issues. So with a smaller sensor, you have from the beginning less of these issues, so astrophotography is easier. Second of all, full frame cameras are extremely expensive. And then the third point is very important, but also rather complicated. And that is that your telescope that you chose has a certain maximum resolution, meaning the light that comes in your telescope can, based on the lenses, only be resolved to a certain degree. If you have now a sensor which has more pixels than actually your telescope can resolve, you're oversampled, which is not good. If on the other side your camera has too large pixels and so the resolution of the telescope is higher, you're undersampled, and that's even worse. So your camera must fit to your telescope. And here again, you see again how everything has to fit together and has to be thought through at the start before we make a buy decision. And so let's go now to the computer. On one side, I will show you the brands and the models, but on the other side, I will show you a site and a tool how you can actually check if your camera and your telescope fit together. So welcome to my computer. First of all, let's look at this here, astronomy.tools. They have really a lot of cool tools which might help you in astrophotography, but we want to go to a very special calculator, and that's the CCD suitability calculator. And CCD, by the way, is actually a wrong expression because in our days these are not CCD cameras anymore but CMOS cameras, but that's semantics. So what do you do here? You choose your telescope. They have a lot of telescopes in here, but otherwise you can also do it manually. So they have here, for example, the ASCAR. Let's take the FRA 400. So then automatically it tells me 400mm focal length. If you would use a reducer, we do not use Barlow lenses for deep space, but it could be that you use a reducer, then you would have to enter it here. But let's assume we use it as it is. And now here you have to enter your camera, and we will come to that in a second, but for the moment let's take one of the mainstream cameras. So a Zibo ASI 2600 mm or MC Pro, that doesn't matter. So you see here now also the pixel size it has, 3.76, and we leave everything else as it is, and it's green. And as you can see, it's in the green area. What also does actually influence that is the seeing. And the seeing actually depends on your location, but it also depends on the weather. So from that point of view, I would always go here with an okay seeing, which is usually what we have, something average. But if you perhaps live in Arizona in the middle of the desert where you always have perfect seeing, then you could actually simulate how is it with exceptional seeing. And now you see actually here we have now a significant undersampling when we have perfect seeing. So the resolution of my camera is not high enough for the resolution of the scope. So if I would go here now with a camera with a much smaller pixel size, let's say 2, you see how it shifts? Suddenly it's better. And by the way, just to show here now, if you would have such a small pixel size with a regular seeing, I would now be in an oversampling, which means pixel size or the overall resolution is much higher than what actually my scope can manage. So this is a little toy, you can always play with it, and you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. But if you're really here in the purple part or in the red part, you have probably chosen the wrong camera for your scope. If we go now to Agena Astro, we go to cooled Astro-cameras. What you can actually see from a manufacturer, we have Zibo 25 cameras and QHY 17 cameras. And so at the end, it's all about the same here. Quality-wise, differences are minor, also feature-wise. So quite honestly, if you go mainstream, I would recommend you go with Zibo. That's really the quasi-standard, I would say. By the way, you also see here some modified Canons. These are now mirrorless cameras where the filter has been removed. But you see, even they are quite expensive, and from that point, I feel this is kind of pointless. So given that anyway, practically the standard is Zibo, I go now also to the Zibo site. ziboastro.com makes it a little bit easier. So let's look at the cooled cameras. And I want to go budget-wise from the lowest to the highest. So if you want to get a cooled Astro camera with a minimum of budget, that's your camera. The ASI 585 MC Pro. It's very new, it was just released a few months ago. And if you have paid attention, this is actually the camera that I showed you as an uncooled model at my planetary rig. So they actually extended now this camera also with a cooler. And when we have a look at it, it has quite a high resolution, and it has with 2.9 micrometers quite small pixels. It's a very modern sensor. The only drawback is obviously that the size of the sensor is rather small, which means even with a FRA 400, for example, you couldn't picture a lot of the nebula because they would be too big for your sensor. So I would say this is really an entry model. And usually the problem with entry models is that after quite a short time you actually realize that you want to have something better. Then you have to sell that again, and so you lose money. Now the next best model is here the ASI 533. And a lot of people recommend this model. You see here the price range, but they offer some packages. But in principle, in an MC version, which is the one-shot color version, it's $799. So that's still a very reasonable price, and it has actually this Sony standard sensor. So in principle, the most used cameras at the moment have these Sony sensors, the IMX sensors, and the only difference from this one to the more expensive one is that it has a square sensor. So usually with an APS-C format you have a rectangular one, here it's square. But that's not really an issue because a lot of objects, they are actually square or round, or so you don't really need this rectangular. So they have this kind of standard pixel size of the 3.76. So from my point of view, this is actually a really good entry camera because it has a state-of-the-art sensor, it has a good format. Based on that it's square, it doesn't get out into the areas of the scope where you get distortions or vignetting or anything. So this is definitely a camera I can recommend. Now, if you can afford a little bit more, this is now the same chip, but in an APS-C format. And that's kind of probably the most sold camera, I would guess, because the model above is then the 6200, which is full frame, which is extremely expensive, and the model below is the 533. So you get this in a color version for the $2,000 and in the mono version for the $2,500. Now what's interesting here, that's the duo version. And that's something really unique which only Zevo offers. And you see that actually here, that this camera has two sensors. One, the big one, the APS-C, and the very tiny one on top here. That is why it's called duo. And what this second sensor actually is for is guiding. And so that's actually really something cool, especially in the color part, if you take the one-shot color, the MC version. Because then you have actually the issue of guiding already solved. And it's not even much more expensive than the version without this. So that's really a great invention of Zevo. If you go with the MM version, I would not take the Duo, because with some filters it doesn't work, because simply the filters do not let enough stars through, enough light through, that the guiding can be successful. But I think for the color camera, that's really quite a cool thing. And then as stated, if you have money to burn, here's the full frame camera of Zevo, the 6200, and you see the prices. And quite honestly, full frame brings more issues than benefits. Because if you don't have a really good scope, you will always have distortion and massive vignetting on the outsides. So that's actually what you have extra. And on the other side, you can actually do mosaics. That's the same as you would do with a regular camera with panoramas. You take multiple pictures and you stitch them together to a larger ones. And you can do that in astrophotography too. So you do not really need such a large sensor. And as last time, you might ask yourself where now the camera is that I actually have on my scope. And as with the mount, it's a European company called Moravian, and it's not in the US offered by the large shops. But again, they ship. And so I have to admit, they are not really into marketing. Their page is quite horrific. And the reason is, and that's quite funny, that they're absolutely maxed out from a capacity point of view. They have sometimes even waiting lists. So what makes these cameras unique? That's the one, by the way, that I have, the C1X 26000. And as you can see, it has exactly the same sensor as the ASI 2600 from Zevo. So what makes this camera so special? On one side, it is quality. It is built like a tank, feels completely different than when you have a Zevo camera in your hands. You can also order it with a higher quality sensor. It's still the same type, but it's industrial quality, so it's designed for the 24/7 usage. It is more efficient from a cooling point of view, it's more reliable, it has no vibration, and very unique to Moravian is that it actually offers a filter wheel with 10 slots. So when you have a lot of filters with SIBO, with a maximum of 7 filters, you're maxed out. But with a Moravian, you can go up to 10 slots. That's also something interesting. So it's a little bit like with the mount. If you're looking for highest quality, something built not in Far East, but in Europe, that's definitely a brand which I can absolutely recommend. A lot of the big observatories around the world, they use Moravian cameras. As with further references, I will add in the description a lot of links to different camera review videos from YouTube, and I will definitely also add the link to this tools list, and I will also add the link to another tool which can help you in making this decision, and also an instructional video how to use it. With that, we're at the end of the camera part. So we have now really the 3 main parts: the camera, the telescope, and the mount. But still, there's a lot more things which we need before we can start. And in the next part, we look at the filters which lie between the camera and the telescope. Until then, clear skies.